casualties will increase. Something you also see in the video is the widespread use of undercover police officers. One, you have undercover police officers who go in and pose as protesters, like recently throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, people who have been proved to be undercover police in order to provide a justification to the media, which this is then shown on Turkish TV as the protesters being violent against the police to justify the police going and battering protesters. But also, like you saw, undercover protesters undercover police attacking protesters in civilian clothes. And so using knives, stabbing protesters, using bats, beating protesters up, incredible stuff taking place. When we were there, things were quiet in Taksim Square, but at the same time there was massive violence taking place in Ankara, across Turkey, but also we travelled out on Saturday night to a working class suburb, predominantly Kurdish, predominantly Alevi, which is a religious minority, many of whom are Kurds, a place called Gazi Mahallesi, where 400,000 people live. And like at that stage, I think many of the localised protests in Istanbul were no longer taking place, but in this place in Gazi Mahallesi, there were still protests taking place on a nightly basis, with 10,000 people, working class people, younger, older, coming together to protest. And it was there that you saw a different side of these protests, because these people told us, look, we always hated the government. We hated the government before. These are people who've suffered systematic discrimination in terms of jobs, in terms of education, systematic oppression and repression by the police, just treated like dirt by the police, regular victims of police brutality. And so whenever the movement developed in Taksim Square and elsewhere across Turkey, they took the opportunity to join in those protests. And so you have a mass revolt. You get a sense of an uprising of 10,000 people engaged in a peaceful protest, being attacked by the police and engaging in a battle with the police. And we saw the end of one of these battles, whereby the police were just completely indiscriminately firing tear gas at people, using flashbang kind of grenades to stun people, breaking through the barricades that people had built and build on a nightly basis in order to come after protesters in an extremely dangerous manner. And it was interesting, we spoke to a young guy there who spoke English. I mean, most people at the square speak some English. Most of the people in Ghazi didn't speak English, a reflection of the different class background of people involved. But we spoke to a young guy there who was a student, and it was interesting because it showed the broad support that the protests in Taksim Square, in Gezi Park, have. Because he said on a daily basis he would participate, he'd stay in the park during the day, and then at night time he would come home to join in the protests and the defence of the protests against the police, but at the same time that there's no coordination between them. And so you have this revolt and uprising happening in a suburb of Istanbul, a massive protest and repression happening in the centre of Istanbul, but then there wasn't enough of a coordination between the two of them. And so the absence of a citywide coordination, countrywide coordination is a certain feature. In terms of what happens next, I mean, what's happened in the last couple of days is that, I mean, the tactic is clear. It's just repression, more repression to try and crush the movement. They haven't been successful so far. This is the impression you would have. There was an attempt yesterday to mobilise 1 million people to retake Taksim Square. I'm not sure if they got 1 million people, but there was a very significant mobilisation of people despite all of the repression. The police again have moved in again this morning to try and expel people from Taksim Square, and I think use such force that it is possible for them to expel people from Taksim Square. The mood of euphoria and victory that was there when we were there is clearly gone. That's been just beaten out of people by what they've done. But at the same time, you got a broad sense that the most popular slogan, which is propagated by the Turkish Communist Party, is Boyun Eğme, which is don't bow down, continue to resist. That as a slogan that people hold, and then type istifa, resign, Erdogan. They're the most popular slogans, and I think it does sum up the fact that for people, it's like to a certain extent people have experienced the ability to defeat the state, to defeat the police, to force them back, and that they're not easily going to go and accept oppression again. And so even if, and it can be the case, that the state wins this round of battles, and that you have massive reprisals against protesters, which we need to be aware of, express solidarity with, try and expose what's happening if that's what happens. Even in those circumstances, I find it hard to believe that you wouldn't have new uprisings, new developments taking place, because you have a sense of arisen people, of people beginning to struggle in a very serious way in wide sections of society to defeat them. It's clear that, I mean, the other things that have been introduced into the discussion is that they say now they'll suspend the building of the park in order to allow a court case to go ahead as to whether it's okay or not. That could be a means of a concession being given by the Erdogan regime, but I don't really trust them, you know. I don't trust them at all, obviously. I think they've lied all the way through this process. They said they only wanted to come into the park to remove the flags and the banners, and then they attacked the protesters. Then they said, well, we only want to remove the protesters from Taksim Square. They can stay in Gezi Park. Now they've said they have to get out of Gezi Park. And so they've lied all throughout this process. They had a false discussion with hand-picked representatives of the movement, which Erdogan personally decided who represented the movement, and then to try and create the idea that there's, you know, some sort of consensus, the protesters are being unreasonable while they batter them. There has been a process of discussion actually with the real representatives of the movement, with Taksim Solidarity, but I don't think any agreement has come out of that, and it's very difficult to see an agreement coming out of it while you have such massive repression. In terms of what way forward now in Turkey, just to give you an insight into some of the debates that are taking place and some of the ideas that we're putting forward in within Turkey. Firstly, that the false discussion of the so-called representatives of the movement should be rejected. The proposal, half a promise, half a suggestion for a referendum on Gezi Park, even though it could potentially be won by the movement, should not be focused on by the movement, should be rejected by the movement. I mean, if the government wants to go and organise a referendum, I'd say fine, let them go and organise a referendum. But the strength of the movement lies in the occupation, in the power of the force of people on the streets, as opposed to the atomised power of people in a voting booth, and that it's probably purely another trick, and they can promise you this, demobilise people, and then they can withdraw even the promise of the referendum or write the question in a certain way designed to get them a majority. And so those attempts to split the movement should be rejected, and you should rely on the power of mass mobilisations. Secondly, and it's not easy, it's really not easy, and it's a hard discussion to have, is probably the movement needs to try to retake the squares. And that's difficult, given the massive scale of repression. I mean, how do you stand up against thousands and thousands of police willing to do anything, you know? And even with, you know, there's video cameras clearly videoing all of this stuff and so much more, but they're still doing it. How can you stand up against that? The first thing is only through mass mobilisation, in which the trade unions have to play an extremely important role. So the general strike tomorrow creates the space whereby people can mobilise to come to the square in massive numbers to try and expel the police. But linked to that has to be a discussion about, well, how do protesters defend themselves against this massive police violence? Not the isolated use by individuals of Molotov cocktails that provides an excuse for the police to go in and attack people, but in a coordinated way, what role can the trade unions, left activists, other activists, what role can they play in defending the movement against the police's attack in a coordinated, democratic way, the defence of protesters, to try to retake the squares, re-establish them as a symbol for the movement, but also a place where the discussions can take place. Linked to that is, if you do manage to retake the squares, and that's obviously a question mark now, is trying to develop the self-organisation and the structures of the movement. It can seem now like a secondary question, like now you're involved in this massive battle with the police, and it's true that you have to try and win in terms of the battle with the police, but if you succeed in creating a space, and even if you don't create a space, even regardless, creating democratic structures whereby the people who aren't represented by the organisations can take ownership of this movement, where they can have a discussion themselves. Because you have to have a massive discussion now about, well, how do we win? How do we take the movement forward? What are our key demands at this stage? What are our key tactics? And so establishing mass popular assemblies if possible, establishing citywide coordination of delegates, countrywide coordination of delegates, a national meeting of protesters, because it's in many different places, but quite disconnected from each other. How can that be developed? And it's important for the strategy of the movement, but also because one of the things that divides the movement is what's your answer to, if you succeed in Tayyip Istifa, if Erdogan resigns, well then what's going to happen? Because most people don't think that the mainstream opposition party, the CHP, traditionally Kemalist, likes to call itself social democratic, but has nothing to do with even social democratic ideas. They don't represent an alternative. The extremely far-right MHP also represented in Parliament, they definitely don't represent an alternative. So what's the alternative? And partly that alternative can be, you can point to an alternative of what a government of working people, of young people would look like if you really develop the self-organisation in the assemblies, but also spread it into neighbourhoods, into factories, etc. We would argue that the 5 demands that I listed earlier, they're now behind the movement in reality. This is no longer, they're important demands, but they're insufficient in and of themselves. That the demand for Erdogan to resign should come now front and centre, because that's what this battle is about, and the government recognises it, and the protesters should officially recognise that. And also to put forward some formulations about radical democratic, radical social change that could meet the aspirations of people, to give a vision that this isn't about trying to help the CHP come back to power, and to be able to speak to those people who might passively support Erdogan at this stage, but who also suffer under his neoliberal policies, who also suffer under his repression. And that in relation to that the left and the workers' movement has a vital role to play. At the moment, I mean, Erdogan is attacking people, he's verbally attacking people with police, but he's also mobilising his own supporters. You have massive rallies, or attempted massive rallies, taking place this Saturday and this Sunday. So yesterday and today across Turkey. And you have to, I mean, potentially defend the protests against physical attacks by these people, but also you have to try and win some of these people. Not necessarily the people who are being mobilised, but the more conservative sections of society and people in more rural areas, to reject the notion of divide and rule, the game that Erdogan is trying to play. And that the left and the workers' movement and the trade union movement has an extremely important role to play. It has a lot to learn from this movement in terms of the power of people, in terms of how to organise from below, but it also does have something to bring to the movement in the sense of its own history, its own traditions, its own experience of repression and fighting in the past. And so one of the positive developments, I mean, the Turkish left is like massively divided. Like they make the Irish left look like one really big happy family. Like really, like, you know, you have many instances of Turkish left organisations in a lot of physical violence against each other, people dying in physical clashes between different left organisations in Turkey. Extremely divided. You have a positive development. You have the BDP, which has a number of representatives in Parliament elected as independents, which is the predominantly Kurdish party, and they have a broader progressive left alliance called the HDK, which has other left organisations involved. And we would argue that you need to develop that and create a broad left organisation, left party in Turkey, whereby the different left organisations can come together, can bring their experiences to bear collectively, and can still have their own ideas and argue for their own ideas and struggle for their own ideas. But that idea of creating such a broad left party to be able to provide direction and assistance for people looking for that at the moment in struggle. And then as part of that, certainly we would be arguing that the idea of a socialist programme, the idea of the wealth being used in the interests of ordinary people, the idea of a genuinely secular state, which does mean the right of women to wear headscarves, which does mean, you know, the right of people to have whatever religion they want without facing oppression from a deep state. So a genuinely secular vision of society. That's the kind of programme that can reach out to broad sections of society and can create the mass basis for the movement that can make it successful. Just finally, what can we do here? It is really important. People there think it's really important that people elsewhere know what's going on, given the role of the Turkish media, but also the Western media. You have a massive distorted story, and so meetings like this, but also people talking to their friends, posting stuff on Facebook, whatever, spreading the information is extremely important. I'm not sure, in the South we've had a number of solidarity protests with the protesters. If it's possible to have such a thing in Belfast, I think that would be extremely positive, to have these protests, just to create pressure on our own governments, and to create pressure, like some sort of pressure from, you know, popular opinion, broadly speaking, on the Erdogan government, to make it more difficult for them to do what they're currently doing, to build the biggest possible solidarity protests. And then the other thing, you know, obviously we have to learn from what's happening in Turkey. We have to follow it, discuss it, learn from it, and then try and apply some of those lessons to our own struggles that we're also engaged in here, like against the G8. I'll leave it at that. Hopefully people have questions and comments for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much.